I've debated sharing this for a long time, but after hearing a story on a podcast that reminded me of my experience, I figured it might help someone out there. This happened about 3 years ago when I had just started a new job and moved to a different city. I'll be vague about some details for privacy, but everything I'm about to tell you is true. I'd taken a job at a mid-sized marketing agency, which meant relocating to a small town about 3 hours away from my family. The move was a big deal for me because I'd been living with my parents until then. I found a small apartment in an older building downtown. It wasn't fancy, but it was affordable and close to work. The first few weeks were uneventful, just settling into the new routine, exploring the area, and getting to know my coworkers. One of my favorite spots quickly became the 24-hour diner a few blocks from my apartment. I'd often stop by after late shifts to grab dinner and unwind. It was the kind of place with cracked leather booths, fluorescent lighting, and waitresses who called you hun. It started one night in mid-December. I'd worked late finishing up a client presentation and decided to grab a bite at the diner before heading home. It was snowing lightly, and the streets were almost deserted. When I walked in, there was only one other customer, a man sitting at the counter. He was probably in his late 40s, wearing a heavy coat and a baseball cap. He looked up briefly when I entered, then went back to staring at his coffee. I didn't think much of it and slid into a booth near the window. I ordered my usual, a burger and fries with a coffee, and started scrolling through my phone while I waited. A few minutes later, I glanced up and noticed the man watching me. He quickly looked away, but something about his expression unsettled me. It wasn't just curiosity, it felt more intentional. I brushed it off. Maybe he was just bored. The waitress brought my food, and I tried to focus on eating, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked up, he'd either be staring directly at me or quickly turning his head like he didn't want to get caught. It was creepy, but I told myself I was overreacting. When I finished eating, I paid my bill and left. The man stayed at the counter, and I felt a wave of relief as I stepped outside. The snow had picked up, and the streets were even emptier than before. I pulled my coat tighter and started the short walk back to my apartment. About halfway there, I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just someone else heading home, but when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw the man from the diner. He was maybe 20 feet behind me, walking at a steady pace. My stomach dropped. I'm not someone who panics easily, but something about the situation felt wrong. I picked up my pace, and so did he. My mind raced. Should I confront him? Call someone? I pulled out my phone and pretended to make a call, hoping it would deter him. "Hey, I'm almost home," I said loudly. "Yeah, just a few minutes." The man didn't stop. If anything, he seemed to be getting closer. My apartment building was just a block away, but I knew better than to lead him straight to where I lived. Instead, I turned the corner and headed toward a small convenience store that was still open. The man followed me the whole way. When I stepped into the store, the bright lights and the sound of the door chime felt like a lifeline. The clerk, a guy in his early 20s, looked up from his phone as I walked in. I went straight to the back of the store and pretended to browse while keeping an eye on the entrance. The man didn't come inside. He just stood outside, pacing back and forth. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The clerk must have noticed something was off because he came over and asked if I was okay. I quickly explained the situation, and he offered to let me stay until the man left. We stood there, watching as the man eventually lit a cigarette and walked away. I waited a few more minutes just to be safe before thanking the clerk and heading home. He offered to call someone for me, but I said I'd be fine. Looking back, I wish I'd taken him up on it. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd catch glimpses of someone who looked like the man from the diner, but I always convinced myself it was just paranoia. That changed the following Saturday. I'd spent most of the day at home working on a freelance project. Around 7 p.m., I decided to take out the trash. My building's dumpster was in an alley around the back, and as I walked down the narrow path, I noticed a figure standing near the dumpster. It was him. He didn't say anything, just stood there watching me. My first instinct was to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond. Instead, he took a step closer. That's when I noticed he was holding something in his hand, a small notebook. Without thinking, I turned and bolted back to the building, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked it and called the police. The officers who arrived were polite, but not particularly helpful. They took my statement and did a quick sweep of the area, but didn't find anyone. They told me to call again if I saw him and suggested I stay with a friend for a while. That wasn't an option for me, so I just double-checked all my locks and hoped for the best. The final incident happened a week later. I'd been extra cautious, avoiding the diner and taking different routes to work. But one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise outside my window. I lived on the second floor, so it wasn't a place where someone could just walk up. I turned off the lights and peered through the blinds. My heart stopped. The man was standing on the fire escape, looking directly at me. He must have climbed up from the alley. Before I could react, he started banging on the window, yelling something I couldn't make out. I grabbed my phone and called 911, barely able to get the words out. The operator stayed on the line with me until the police arrived. By the time they got there, the man was gone, but they found footprints in the snow leading to the fire escape. That was the last time I saw him, but the experience left me shaken. I ended up breaking my lease and moving out a month later. I also started taking self-defense classes and carrying pepper spray everywhere I go. I still think about him sometimes, especially when I'm out late or feel like someone's watching me. The police never found him, and I never learned what he wanted or why he targeted me. All I know is that I'll never take my safety for granted again. If you're reading this, please trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Stay safe out there. I've never been the type to scare easily. I grew up in a rough neighborhood, learned early how to watch my back, and I always thought I had a pretty good sense for danger. But what happened to me last winter still keeps me up at night. I've never told anyone about it, but writing this down feels like the only way to make sense of it. It started after I took a job working the night shift at a hospital. I'm an RN, and while the hours were brutal, the pay was decent, and I figured I could handle the quieter pace. The hospital was an older building, not one of those shiny new places. Parts of it felt like they hadn't been updated since the 70s, with flickering lights and endless, echoing hallways. Most nights it was just me and a couple of other staff members on my floor, plus a security guard who occasionally patrolled. One night in December, I was scheduled for a double shift. It was snowing hard outside, the kind of storm that makes the whole world feel muffled. The ER was quiet, and after making my rounds, I decided to grab a coffee from the staff lounge. The vending machine was ancient and temperamental, but it was better than nothing. As I stood there waiting for the machine to spit out my cup, I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the hum of the old building, but then I realized it sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and too heavy to be one of my coworkers. I froze, listening. They seemed to be coming from the corridor that led to the old wing, a section of the hospital that had been closed for renovations months ago. I told myself it was probably the security guard doing his rounds, but something about the rhythm of the steps didn't sit right with me. They were too measured, almost like whoever it was wanted to be heard. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the noise. The hallway to the old wing was dimly lit, and the further I walked, the colder it got. By the time I reached the heavy double doors that marked the entrance to the closed section, I could see my breath in the air. The doors were supposed to be locked, but one of them was slightly ajar. I hesitated, considering whether to call the security guard, but curiosity got the better of me. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The old wing was even darker than the rest of the hospital, with only a few emergency lights casting long shadows. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but everything seemed normal. Empty rooms, overturned chairs, and dust-covered equipment. That's when I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were closer, coming from somewhere deeper in the wing. My heart was racing, but I kept moving, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. "Is someone there?" No answer, just silence, heavy and oppressive. I was about to turn back when I noticed something at the end of the hallway. It was a figure, standing perfectly still. I could barely make it out in the dim light, but it looked like a man wearing a long coat. His head was tilted slightly, like he was watching me. I froze, every instinct telling me to run, but I couldn't look away. Then, without warning, he took a step toward me. Just one step, but it was enough to snap me out of my trance. I turned and bolted, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted back to the main part of the hospital. When I reached the staff lounge, I locked the door behind me and tried to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I called the security guard, who showed up a few minutes later. I told him what I'd seen, and he agreed to check it out. I waited in the lounge, trying to calm down. When the guard returned, he said he hadn't found anyone. He assured me the doors to the old wing were locked, and I must have imagined it. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing in the hallway. For the next few weeks, I avoided the old wing entirely. I didn't tell anyone else what had happened, partly because I didn't want to seem paranoid, and partly because I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But things didn't stop there. It started with small things. Lights flickering more than usual. Strange noises that no one else seemed to hear. One night, I found a patient's chart in a room I hadn't been in all shift. Another time, I discovered a set of footprints in the snow outside the hospital, leading to a window in the old wing. The security guard brushed it off as kids messing around, but I wasn't so sure. Then, one night, I was working alone on my floor when the power went out. The backup generators kicked in almost immediately, but the sudden darkness was enough to set me on edge. I grabbed my flashlight and tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I was checking on a patient when I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were on my floor, slow and deliberate, just like before. I turned off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear. The steps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside the patient's room. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly, I was sure whoever it was could hear it. The door creaked open, and for a moment, I thought I was going to pass out. But when I looked, there was no one there. Just an empty hallway stretching out into the dim light of the emergency bulbs. I didn't finish my shift that night. I told my supervisor I wasn't feeling well and went home. Over the next few weeks, I started looking for another job. I couldn't handle the constant fear, the sleepless nights, the feeling that something was always just out of sight. I've since moved to a different hospital in a different city, and nothing like that has happened again. But every now and then, when I'm working a night shift and the building goes quiet, I'll catch myself listening for those footsteps. And every time, I'm terrified I might hear them again. I've always been someone who keeps to themselves. It's not that I'm antisocial. I just like my space and my routines. Maybe that's why what happened last January shook me so badly. I thought I was careful. I thought I was safe. But I've learned that sometimes, no amount of caution can protect you from someone who's determined. It started one evening after work. I'd been pulling long hours at the office to finish up a big project, and by the time I left, it was already dark. The snow was coming down hard, and the streets were almost empty. I remember being glad for the silence, the way the snow seemed to absorb all the noise. My usual route home took me past a small park. It wasn't much, just a few benches and a cluster of trees, but at night it could feel almost eerie. I had my hood up and my headphones in, listening to a podcast, when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just the wind blowing through the trees, but then I saw him. He was standing under one of the streetlights, just far enough away that I couldn't make out his face. He was tall, wearing a heavy coat and a knit cap, and he wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. I've always been cautious, so I kept my pace steady and avoided looking directly at him. I told myself it was nothing, just some guy waiting for a bus or taking a walk. But when I glanced over my shoulder a block later, he was still there. Same distance, same steady pace. My heart started to race. I've heard all the advice about how to handle situations like this. Stay in well-lit areas, don't go straight home, call someone if you can. I pulled out my phone and pretended to be on a call, speaking loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Yeah, I'm almost home." "No, I'm fine. Just a couple more blocks." He didn't stop. If anything, he seemed to be getting closer. I turned the corner onto a busier street, hoping the brighter lights and occasional cars would deter him. But when I glanced back again, he was still there, now just a few steps behind me. My apartment building was only a block away, but I knew better than to lead him there. Instead, I ducked into a convenience store and went straight to the counter. The clerk, a young guy with a bored expression, barely glanced up as I leaned in. "Hey, I think someone's following me," I said, keeping my voice low. "Can I stay here for a bit?" The clerk nodded and gestured toward the back of the store. I grabbed a bottle of water and pretended to browse the shelves, keeping an eye on the door. A minute later, the man walked past. He didn't come inside, but he paused just outside the window, looking in. I'll never forget the way he stared, like he was trying to decide whether to wait for me or move on. After what felt like an eternity, he walked away. I stayed in the store for another 20 minutes, just to be safe, before asking the clerk to call me a cab. When I finally got home, I double-checked all my locks and left the lights on. I barely slept that night. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I left my apartment, I found myself scanning the street, looking for any sign of him. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. But then, things started happening that I couldn't explain. One morning, I found a footprint in the snow outside my bedroom window. My apartment was on the ground floor, and while it wasn't unusual for people to cut through the courtyard, the footprint was right next to the glass. Too close. Another time, I came home to find my doormat slightly askew, like someone had been standing on it. I told myself it could have been the wind, but deep down I knew better. The breaking point came a week later. I'd gone out to dinner with a friend and was walking home around 9 p.m. The streets were quiet, the snow muffling my footsteps. As I turned onto my block, I saw him again. He was standing in the shadows near my building, half hidden behind a tree. My stomach dropped. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pulled out my phone and called 911, keeping my voice steady as I described the situation. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and head somewhere safe, so I turned and walked quickly toward the nearest bar. I didn't run, but every step felt agonizingly slow, like I was moving through quicksand. When I reached the bar, I ducked inside and locked myself in the restroom. The dispatcher stayed with me until the police arrived, and when I came out, they were waiting. I told them everything, from the first night I'd seen him to the footprints outside my window. They took my statement and promised to patrol the area, but I could tell they didn't think it was a big deal. I didn't see him again after that, but the fear didn't go away. I changed my routines, started taking different routes to work, and even bought new locks for my apartment. I'd like to say that I feel safe now, but the truth is, I'm always looking over my shoulder. Every time I hear footsteps behind me, my heart skips a beat. Every time I pass a shadowy figure on the street, I feel that same rush of panic. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, and maybe I never will. But I've learned that sometimes all it takes is one person to shatter your sense of safety. So if you're reading this, please trust your instincts. If something feels off, don't ignore it. Stay safe.